and he's now a faculty member for the Communications program, the Vietnam campus of Australia's Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Saigon, where he's lived for the past 6 years. So he flew all the way around the world to be with us today. Joel Penney is an assistant professor at the School of Communications and Media at Montclair State University. And we also have Rob Horning, who's the editor for The New Inquiry. So we're going to try to keep to time. That way we have plenty of time for questions at the end of the panel. So I'll be letting the panelists know how they're doing on time. And if you, again, have any questions, you can tweet them or we can get to them after the presentation. So with that, I'm going to give it to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out early this Saturday morning to hear from us. I'm going to stand up because I'm more comfortable standing up. Last summer, people in Vietnam were eagerly anticipating the premiere of a locally produced film there called Boi Doi Cho Lon, The Street Children of Chinatown. It was a formulaic gangster-style action film set in the Chinatown neighborhood of Ho Chi Minh City. People there were excited for it because it was set in Ho Chi Minh City. It was a relatively rare foreign import. And it was been promoted heavily for weeks. But just a few days before the June opening date of the film, officials in the Ministry of Information and Communication canceled the release of Boi Doi Cho Lon. They said it was too violent and that it didn't reflect the social reality of Vietnam. So that weekend, everybody went to see World War Z and White House Down instead. I did. It's not like this is without precedent. Vietnam has a long history of censoring popular entertainment. A year previously, in 2012, the same government office had banned all in-country screenings of The Hunger Games on a similar premise, that it was too violent. What officials didn't say at that time was that The Hunger Games depicts a popular revolution against a repressive, corrupt government of self-serving elites intent on keeping its people poor, ignorant, and powerless. Must have slipped their minds. But where people had taken the Hunger Games decision in stride the year before, something different happened last summer. This happened. Remixes and mashups of the film's promotional poster began appearing online. Technically unsophisticated but clever parodies subtly mocking the ministry's decision. Of course, they included the obligatory remix of Hitler reacting to the news. Another version took a confrontation between two rival gangs that appeared in the film's online trailer and tweaked it before censorship and after censorship. A site that remixes panels and characters from the Japanese manga Doraemon took that idea, modified it, and posted their own version. In a recursive, iterative cycle, these images and hundreds of others like them were created, modified, and shared thousands of times on Facebook, which has been blocked in Vietnam at the DNS level since 2009. They appeared in the many online discussion forums that are so popular there, such as Webchaita and Tende. Where the Hunger Games decision came and went without much fanfare the year before, this time the issue didn't go anywhere. It stayed alive, as every time someone shared one of these images, another conversation about it started. And not everybody believed that the film should have been shown. There were lots of online comments defending the ban, justifying the decision to kill Boi Doi Cho Lon. That's not surprising, but it is unusual because these very public debates and conversations about this topic, censorship, hadn't really existed a year before. It's also interesting because the people who created these images and shared them didn't make their point with angry blog posts written in all caps, but by using the tools of remix and pop culture and humor. Vietnam, of course, is Asia's other rapidly developing autocratic communist state. Like its neighbor to the north, it undertook quasi-free market reforms a couple of decades ago, and now Vietnam is in the midst of a huge economic boom. It has a big emerging middle class and an internet penetration of nearly 40% among its 92 million people. Incidentally, Vietnam is the 13th largest nation in the world by population. True fact. As in China, Vietnam, almost all media in Vietnam is at least partially state-owned and very tightly controlled. And authorities there have a habit of jailing outspoken bloggers on charges of abusing democratic freedoms and spreading propaganda against the state. Last year, 61 Vietnamese citizens were given lengthy prison terms for peacefully expressing themselves on the internet, more than any nation in the world except for one. Unlike China, however, Vietnam's internet is relatively open. Google and YouTube are among the top visited sites there. Most of the social media platforms that you and I use are available there. And despite the ban on Facebook, the block on Facebook at the DNS level, easily circumvented, more than 20 million Vietnamese people update their status every day. That means that 70% of Vietnam's internet users have a Facebook page. In the US, that figure's 55%. It's also important to keep in mind that for generations, Vietnam has nurtured a collectivist Confucian ideology that places national development, political stability, social harmony, and respect for authority above almost all individual interests. A great firewall has never really been necessary here. Between the chilling effect of regular arrests and imprisonments and decades of social conditioning, political commentary on the internet is understandably rare. It's considered dangerous, pointless, and, at least among older citizens, un-Vietnamese. But that's changing. For the past 5 years, I've taught communication, a course called Asian Cybercultures at the RMIT University. It's an Australian offshore campus in Saigon. And last spring, I noticed that many of my students had begun citing examples of remix culture and user-generated content from a new image-sharing website calling itself HiVL. HiVL. The name means funny in Vietnamese, among other much naughtier things. And the users of HiVL, which seems remarkably similar to sites like 9gag, had begun churning out silly troll faces and template memes. And these images proliferated across the Vietnamese web with astonishing speed, partly because social media is an affirmation of everything a collectivist culture holds most dear, and also because today's Vietnamese youth, who have come of age in a globalized, internet-connected society, are very different people from their grandparents and their parents. They outnumber them, too. 65% of the current population is under the age of 30. But there's another reason. Last year, at almost exactly the same moment, as many of you might recall, Facebook introduced a new function allowing users to comment by posting an image with no accompanying text. This changed everything. In a place where the wrong words can land you in jail, there's a powerful sense of security in being able to express yourself to thousands of people without writing anything. Almost overnight, meme culture blew up in Vietnam. Pretty soon, HiVL was giving Google and YouTube competition for web traffic. Clones of HiVL popped up like mushrooms, and the remixers began getting more creative. This is the Tweet Bitch collection. It's a Facebook page that was created last August, and it now has a little over 250,000 followers. The Tweet Bitch collection specializes in remixing Disney animated film stills and characters with Vietnamese text and complex references to the social and pop cultural ecosystem. They put up 2 or 3 of these a day, riffing on the kind of issues that all Vietnamese youth would be able to identify with. Money, family, love, sex, the lack of sex, current web trends, issues in the news. They rarely engage in overt political talk, but in an authoritarian nation with no civil society, in which every moving part is explicitly controlled by a single party, pretty much everything is political by default. A typical post from these guys gets 10 to 20,000 likes, a few hundred comments, and is shared as many as 1,000 times across the Facebook network, and that's only on Facebook. I know global brands that would kill for that kind of engagement. Tweet Bitch is 2 young guys, both with full-time jobs, who do this on laptops out of their bedrooms in their spare time. This all puts me in mind of what Ethan Zuckerman of Berkman Center has called a cute cat theory of internet digital activism. Among other things, that theory suggests that Ordinary online tools and platforms, the kind that people commonly use to share innocuous content, such as cute pictures of cats, make it possible for non-activist users to create and disseminate activist content online. And to me, that seems like exactly what's happening here. I would guess that very few of the young Vietnamese participating in all of this think of themselves as activists with a political agenda. They're just kids communicating in the way that seems most natural to them about things they find interesting and amusing. The tools of remix and meme culture are by nature innocuous. Most of the stuff from Tweet Bitch is created in PowerPoint, if you can believe it. How much less threatening can you get than the Ancient Aliens guy? On the surface, it all appears to be just harmless fun and therefore inoffensive to both government officials and, crucially, to other citizens. The medium of the message allows indirect social and political commentary to sneak in disguised as lulz. And it also assures that the content is shared much more widely and viewed much more widely than direct critique would be. In between the two poles of the starry-eyed techno-utopians and the skeptics, there are thinkers who suggested that the real potential of online tools for social change in places like Vietnam is not necessarily in coordinating massive street protests and mobilizing activist movements, but rather in how they enable citizens to articulate and debate a welter of conflicting ideas throughout society. In other words, social media may matter most not in the streets and the squares, but in the myriad spaces of the social commons that Jürgen Habermas called the public sphere. These images and the worldviews behind them are becoming part of the national discourse in Vietnam. And in the process, they are quietly, incrementally shifting the zeitgeist. One more example. Last summer, Vietnam's top health official badly bungled her ministry's response to a series of vaccine-related infant deaths. This time, the remixers drove the online conversation again with a flood of repurposed images. This one is an imaginary new national stamp honoring the health minister for her service, but it just wouldn't stick. Online commenters had great fun explaining that's because people were spitting on the front of the stamp instead of the back. Photos of the minister, not an especially attractive woman, was given a wide, endless variety of satirical captions. The Tweet Bitch collection got involved in the fun, not surprisingly. Another version was a mock advertisement which had the minister endorsing a potent anti-shame cream. A favorite of mine was a get-out-of-trouble free card for government officials. Use in dangerous situations to avoid penalties of all kinds. Unlimited usage. After a couple of months of this, a mainstream online newspaper, the Petro Times, published an op-ed in which they suggested that maybe, for the good of the country, it might be best if the minister considered stepping down. This was the first time in the history of modern Vietnam that a state-controlled news outlet had openly called for the resignation of a senior party official. Within a few hours, not surprisingly, the op-ed had been taken down, relegated to the memory hole. But screen grabs of that op-ed continue to circulate widely around Vietnam. And at a news conference a short time later, a top party official was asked on the record if he thought that the health minister should resign over pressure from Vietnam's, quote, online public sphere. Vietnam is hardly the only place where this has been happening. We saw it just a few weeks ago in Turkey, as all of you probably remember. Artist and internet commentator Anne Xiaomina of the Civic Beat calls meme culture the street art of the internet. She's pointed out that Weibo users in China have for a long time been using internet memes to circumvent and mock government censorship there. They can even jump the rails of the web and burst out into the real world where their impact is even more powerful. It's often said by way of criticism that these images are amateurish and juvenile and short-lived, and that's true. But they seem to be achieving what all the finger-wagging from the dissident bloggers in Western democracies has not. They're changing minds. And they're doing so precisely because they are juvenile and short-lived and ephemeral and, yes, often silly. That's the whole point. As for what all this means for Vietnam's future, well, I think if we're expecting Tahrir Square or Gezi Park to break out in Hanoi anytime soon, that's not going to happen. Vietnam has had enough of violent conflict to last for a very long time. But as scholars like Clay Shirky and Zeynep Tufekci have suggested, perhaps it's time we stop spending so much time paying attention to the high drama of social media-fueled protests and instead start considering these tools' roles in capacity building. It's also a mistake to consider all of this through the lens of Western assumptions and expectations. A young Vietnamese friend of mine said to me recently, the revolution is beginning here, but it will happen in a Vietnamese way, not a Western way. One more point. Last November, a few months after Vietnam's Minh community went apeshit over the censorship of Boi Doi Cho Lan, and just a year after Vietnam had banned the Hunger Games throughout the country, the second film in that franchise, Catching Fire, opened in hundreds of Vietnamese cinemas without a word from the censorship committee about it being too violent or too anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was excellent. Next, we're going to hear from Joel Penney. Do you have anything that needs to be set up, or you're?
No, actually, I'm just going to be reading from my prepared notes, so I'm going to do about the old school presentation over here, and I think I'm going to sit here just because it's easier. Okay. All right, so 20 years ago, it's been now 20 years since 1994, so that's quite surprising. But 20 years ago, the journalist and media critic Douglas Rushkoff released the book Media Virus, which became one of the most influential and most criticized early works of web theory. Well, the book went on to inspire a generation of commercial marketers to craft promotional messages that spread and replicated across digital networks. Rushkoff's focus was, in fact, the use of viral dissemination techniques for radical and progressive political activism. 5 years later, Cal Lassen, the founder of Adbusters magazine, advanced a similar model of the new media activism in a book called Culture Jam, calling for his followers to kick off a left progressive revolution by acting as, quote, meme warriors. Now, both of these books put forth a postmodernist influenced theorization of political power as the equivalent of networked communicative power in a fully saturated media world. Now, on the 15th and 20th anniversaries of these seminal works, respectively, I want to re-examine their controversial claims and consider how their theories of media contagion as political power inform our contemporary debates about slaptism and the value of symbolic political expression on the web. Now, my argument is that these popular works of media criticism can be viewed in retrospect as forming the foundation for a persuasion model of political internet use that has since appeared in a handful of scholarly works. I'm thinking of people like Manuel Castells' notion of communication power in the network society, as well as Ethan Zuckerman, who was just mentioned before, his notion of digital civics as supporting a cultural theory of change as opposed to a legislative theory of change. Sort of similar to what we were just hearing about. But this model of change, of course, is yet to be really systematically tested in terms of its efficacy, if it really could ever be tested, really considering the diffuse, long-term, and indirect cultural effects that it suggests. Yet in contrast to more established academic models, and I'm thinking of things like digital deliberative democracy, the more rationalist public sphere, as well as civic cultures, these don't have time to really go into these models, but this persuasion model that I'm talking about, advanced by Rushkoff and Lassen, is particularly useful, I think, for thinking critically through a variety of recent politically oriented web phenomena, like profile picture changing campaigns, political viral videos, hashtag activism, and the like. Now, both authors, I think, could be credited with helping to popularize the notion that in order to effectively make a difference in a media-drenched society, citizens must focus much of their energy on promoting and marketing their interests via participatory media platforms. Now, my forthcoming book project, I call this the citizen marketer approach. The citizen marketer can be defined as a person who consciously uses her promotional power as a micro-level peer-to-peer agent in the broader information economy to advance a political agenda. They essentially act as the political equivalent of commercial brand advocates or brand evangelists or viral marketing agents, in a similar way to I'm now promoting David Lynch movies on my t-shirt.
And this is going on sort of in a mediated marketplace of ideas, disseminating persuasive content in a peer-to-peer fashion as a means of contributing to the shaping of the public mind. So Lazin's Culture Jam, released in 1999, reads in hindsight as a manifesto of sorts for this citizen marketer approach that I'm identifying here. Lazin lays out a vision of contemporary political struggle as taking place entirely within the circulation of persuasive media messages. Now, this echoes theorists of so-called postmodern politics, for instance, Stephen Bess and Douglas Kellner, who argue that in an era in which, quote, social life is filtered through the media, politics becomes a battle of images. So in a similar sense, Lazin writes, quote, the next revolution, World War III, will be, as Marshall McLuhan predicted, a guerrilla information war fought not in the sky or on the streets, but in newspapers and magazines, on radio and TV, and in cyberspace. It will be a dirty, no-holds-barred propaganda war of competing worldviews and alternative visions of the future. Now, elsewhere he writes, quote, activists can stage sit-ins, organize massive protests, and stage mighty battles with the riot police. But these events will at best flicker briefly on the evening news and be gone with no demonstrable change in the world. They are spectacles with radium half-lives. The real riots, the important ones that shift alliances, shake governments, win or lose elections, and force corporations and industries to rethink their agendas, now take place inside your head, end quote. So sort of taking politics from the streets into this sort of persuasion of the mind. Now, for those who criticize so-called slacktivism or clicktivism as threatening to replace hard-fought politics on the ground with the more facile politics on the screen, Lazin's logic here might sound quite dangerous. In fact, I would argue that much of the current slacktivism debate hinges upon whether one buys into this postmodernist vision of a mediatized politics that Lazin celebrates and proselytizes in Culture Jam, and Rushkoff does as well, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, the fact that Lazin is the same person who is really responsible for launching Occupy Wall Street in 2011 through his Adbusters outfit may seem to contradict this emphasis that he has here on meme warfare over face-to-face protests in the streets. However, Lazin's statements in Culture Jam back in '99 offer a way of interpreting the true strategic purpose and intention of Occupy Wall Street, at least in its initial conception on his end. Of course, others took it in other directions afterwards. But for Lazin, I really believe Occupy Wall Street was a meme, a media event, a skirmish in this propaganda war that he is imagining, designed more to create a collective mind shift, as he would call it, rather than to create direct material change on the ground. Now, extending his military metaphor of a propaganda or information war, Lazin calls for a new generation of political activists to serve as, quote, meme warriors, active participants in the persuasion game of a fully mediatized politics, whose weapons consist of videos, graphics, image macros, advertising slogans, forwarded articles, and the like. Now, although this use of the term meme that he's using is somewhat different from our contemporary usage, I mean, he's really referring to Richard Dawkins' original notion of infectious ideas that take hold throughout societies, as opposed to our more narrow sense of socially shared digital content. But I think that Lazin's formulation here, meme warriors, is rather prophetic. Recognizing prior to our sort of social media age that, quote, the internet is one of the most potent meme replicating mediums ever invented, Lazin more or less predicts the direction that sort of this, what I'm calling citizen marketing, or really activism in general online, has taken in the era of Facebook and Twitter. His strong belief that communicative power is the primary locus of all contemporary political power even leads him to proclaim that meme warriors will eventually emerge as the central actors on the stage of world politics. So here's another quote. Potent memes can change minds, alter behavior, catalyze collective mind shifts, and transform cultures, which is why meme warfare has become the geopolitical battle of the information age. Whoever has the memes has the power, end quote. Now, while Lazin's faith in the absolute political efficacy of meme warfare may be reasonably questioned, and I think it should be, his vision has undoubtedly reverberated throughout the culture and influenced the development of activism strategies to no small degree. Now, indeed, political organizations from across the spectrum now increasingly function as what Lazin dubbed in his book meme factories, churning out short bits of persuasive media content, or propaganda in his terms, and summoning supporters to spread them across a swath of digital networks and throughout other public venues. So I'm thinking, examples like the red equal sign image of the Human Rights Campaign that was on Facebook, the Coney 2012 video of the group Invisible Children. Really, most of the stuff we saw in the previous Vietnam examples I might include are sort of examples of this. Well, that was sort of informal, but I'm talking more about organizations who produce these kind of memes as a tool of activism. Now, whether or not these campaigns, of course, are successful in creating any political change through this peer-to-peer meme warfare is a whole other question. But either way, I think Lassen can be credited or blamed with popularizing this approach to activism. Now, but at least 5 years before Culture Jam in 1994, Douglas Rushkoff's book Media Virus offers a quite similar vision of how political activism must adapt to a fully media-centric society. His ideas are predicated upon a belief shared by Lassen and the postmodernists more broadly that politics has become an entirely mediatized phenomenon. So as he puts it, quote, "Power today has little to do with how much property a person owns or commands. It is instead determined by how many minutes of primetime TV or pages of news media attention she can access or occupy. The ever-expanding media has become a true region, the data sphere," he calls it, which he situates as the primary terrain of contemporary politics. He goes on to describe a new generation of media activists who inherently understand this postmodern social reality and thus seek to, quote, "hack the data network" as a means of reshaping the world. And now here's another quote from Rushkoff. "People who lack traditional political power but still seek to influence the direction of our culture do so by infusing new ideas into this ever-expanding data sphere. These information bombs spread throughout the entire information net in a matter of seconds." Now, he wrote this 20 years ago. Rushkoff thus suggests a networked model of influence that acutely foreshadows the viral marketing model of the Web 2.0 era, in which messages are spread in peer-to-peer fashion with the goal of capturing the attention and ultimately the hearts and minds of the public. So indeed, Media Virus has played a significant role in popularizing the concept of viral media more broadly since its release in the mid-1990s, influencing both commercial marketing strategies as well as political ones. However, it is the latter, again, that is Rushkoff's primary focus, as he claims that the growth of participatory feedback media like the internet, quote, "have permitted our citizenry to graduate from passive, ignorant spectators to active, informed participants." We hear a lot about this, and, quote, "provides the ability to mount real grassroots countercultural campaigns." So mirroring Lassen's optimistic view of the persuasive power of meme warfare, Rushkoff describes how members of these grassroots campaigns, quote, "depend on a worldview that accepts that a tiny virus launched creatively and distributed widely can topple systems of thought as established as organized religion and institutions as well-rooted as, say, the Republican Party or even the two-party system altogether," end quote. So in other words, the media virus is imagined to not only allow new participants to enter this marketplace of ideas, but also to provide them with an opportunity to emerge as victorious by winning over one citizen at a time. Now, the key assumption underlying these biological metaphors, viral media, memes, and so forth, is that we're talking about uncontrollable forces of cultural contagion spreading from person to person through mere contact and ultimately overtaking the public mind as a kind of ideological pandemic. Now, understandably, Media Virus has been roundly criticized for proposing such an overly mechanistic model of social influence. For instance, Henry Jenkins holds up this book by Rushkoff as a prime example of what he calls a flawed way to think about distributing content through informal or ad hoc networks. So for Henry Jenkins, reducing people to involuntary hosts of media viruses undermines the role of human agency in the peer-to-peer spread of media messages, leading him to suggest that the term viral media be retired altogether in favor of his less deterministic-sounding spreadable media. That's the title of his most recent book. So now, however, as much as this viral metaphor of involuntary contagion may be far from the reality, it is important to acknowledge how it has impacted the way in which political power is conceived in an era in which going viral has become a key cultural catchphrase. While the notion of viral infection paints a picture of weak and vulnerable audiences that are susceptible to outside control, it also makes this control to appear equally as accessible to anyone who wishes to seize it for his or her own purposes. In other words, the viral media metaphor can be simultaneously empowering and disempowering for individual citizens, depending upon whether one sees him or herself as an active agent of dissemination or as merely a host, or in Lassen's terms, maybe a meme warrior or a conquered subject. So this double-edged sword of the viral model of influence places, I think, an imposition of sorts upon those who hope to see their political interests succeed in this sort of hyper-reality marketplace of ideas. Either infect the media or the media will infect you. I think that sort of imposition is on a lot of us. Presented with this choice, it is understandable that many citizens would try their hand at the media contagion game in the service of furthering their own political agendas. So thus, while we certainly can uphold that the process of spreading media messages across peer-to-peer networks is rich with human agency at every stage, of course, people have to decide if they're going to forward something, retweet something, share a link, like content, etc. So there's a lot of human agency here. It's not contagion. But we can also recognize how this viral notion of contagion may be acting as a driving force in the popular uptake of this kind of approach to activism. In other words, imagining those around you as potential targets for your infectious message or meme provides an encouraging sense that you might just be able to make an impact on them and thus contribute to this broader shaping of the public mind. Although the viral model is far too simplistic and mechanical to actually work as automatically as it suggests, it appears to serve as a useful fiction for many who wish to assert some small degree of control or influence over this fully mediatized political world, which is often kind of coming down from above, top down, excuse me. So this is the point that I really want to close with. While notions of memetics and viral contagion on the web are certainly borrowed from biological science, I believe they are fundamentally metaphorical as opposed to scientific. But that doesn't mean that they're not without meaning or value. Rather, they provide seductive ways of conceiving of the web and its power to influence the political and social world. And these metaphors have important consequences. I'm thinking here of the work of George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, right? Metaphors have a lot of social consequences. Depending upon one's relative optimism or pessimism about the true ability to effect change through participatory marketing or propaganda tactics, these metaphors and their progenitors, Rushkoff and Lassen, may alternately be seen as inspiring or enervating. All right, that's it. Thank you.
The clicker.
It's like on the PDF, it's on like the Adobe.
I'm glad you talked
Yeah.
about it because it's so easy for people to get, they think, oh, this is exactly what Richard Dawkins was talking about. And like, no, it's not really. It's so people listen, the meme that we're talking about. And I spent in my paper, I actually spent a long time talking about how, web memes and this stuff is different from even the study of memetics as it's understood.
I think it's kind of a black hole that people sometimes try to make it scientific in a way that it's not.
Right, exactly.
There it is. Yeah, I feel like I'm coming at this virality thing from a very different angle. This is not a meme warring going on in what I'm talking about. It's a lot more self-promotion, I guess. The warrior fighting is to get yourself into the public sphere as a self. Is sort of more what I'm addressing, and I guess I'm sort of starting from the standpoint that's probably much more cynical. That the politics involved in spreading memes is always sort of a pretense to spread yourself in networks. So I'm sort of at a cynical sort of far end of this thing. Anyway. With social media, the compelling opportunities for self-expression outstrip the supply of things we have to confidently say about ourselves. The demand for self-expression overwhelms what we might dredge up from the inside, from our true selves. So the self that we're expressing in social media has to be posited elsewhere. We start to borrow from the network. We start to borrow from imagined future selves that we can project. We start to borrow from the media themselves and from the other kinds of content circulating there that we can now constitute ourselves with. This kind of thing doesn't guarantee that we're personally growing by sort of assimilating all these things, however. The more we express ourselves for self-definition, the more we limit the self to what we have the means to circulate. The sort of self we can imagine ourselves to be becomes contingent on the available media, not on any kind of inner being. So social media offer a wealth of new resources, images, links, the sort of viral stuff we've already been talking about, to continue to bait us into becoming ourselves. On social media. These things seem to let us express the self without, say, the limits of language or the fixed centrality of the speaking subject, the sorts of things that people, held to be limiting and constricting and so on and so forth. The self in social media seems to be very fluid. You get to express yourself through a suite of social media accounts and you sort of pour into networked space from all over the place. You spill over the edge of a unitary profile and you have the freedom to renege on any kind of precomposed identity in favor of ongoing glimpses at your process of self-composition. The push towards a self-concept of perpetual becoming would seem to thwart subjectivation as a kind of social control. But the more we construct identity through these means of social media, the more we self-assimilate into the incentives built into them, which is to turn all experience into more and more strategic expression. So the question is, how damaging is this really? Users generally behave as though social media are safe spaces to reveal the self as an imperfect work in progress. But the media themselves typically compile a permanent archive of our becoming, which negates that provisional nature of the self that we're constructing. As much as the self feels uncontainable, it's still contained by the sort of archive. So we have a sort of conflict, there's a contradiction, a tension between the feed that we experience when we consume social media and the profile, which is sort of the residue or the sort of the remainder that comes from that engagement. So it becomes the user's problem to manage the tension between the static profile and the real-time experience of being a self in a dynamic social media feed environment. So how do users balance the freewheeling pursuit of immediacy, attention, and salience within the network with the threat that it will all go on their permanent record? I think what happens is that we have authenticity fracturing. So the tension between the archive and the feed puts pressure on this concept of authenticity, which is always in the process of being debunked and has a lot of obvious problems with it, but it lingers on as a kind of compass to the self, and it seems to be a common thing to judge yourself in terms of how authentic you are being to some concept of yourself. I think that social media puts pressure on that concept of an authentic self, and I think what happens is we sort of split into two concurrent things working together. Active social media use urges a de facto rejection of the true self that users may not be ready to accept ideologically, but it still happens. It calls for a self that's reconstituted for yourself and for other people, the same way that our news feeds are reconstituted in real time, or recommendation pages are reconstituted. The self is very dynamic in the social media environment in that it's processing things that you've done and projecting a version of yourself to you. And yet we still have this internal sense that we're already coherent, we're already stemming from within a coherent being. So I think the use of social media pressures, that pressure fractures authenticity into these two different poles, the post-authentic viral self, or maybe I should call it the spreadable self, in honor of Henry Jenkins, and what I'm calling sort of a negative theology of self, which I'm going to talk about next. The possibility that everything we do on networks is surveilled has generated an urge to remove the true self from the charted territory of social media. In an essay recently about Google Glass, the artist Molly Crabable argued that, quote, the things we once called souls are not legible to the algorithms. The network alters you in ways that make you more legible to the network, but maybe there are still some things it still can't get. That seems like it's almost like a faith-based statement. But I think that's like a sort of feeling that emerges from using social media is a sense that that there must be something that is not going to become strategic expression in social media. As we make ourselves or are made more legible to the network, we may become more aware of what isn't translatable to its formats. That means that deeper engagement with social networks, with social media, could provide a more thorough awareness of what our soul could be. In an essay called Returning the Dream, the psychologist Adam Phillips quotes another psychologist, D.W. Winnicott. At the center of each person is an incommunicado element, and this is sacred and most worthy of preservation. Phillips interprets this as a, quote, negative theology of the self, and argues that in Winnicott, the aim of intimacy is to sponsor the solitary unknowability of the true self. Now, if that's so, then social media would seem to destroy intimacy altogether, replacing it with sharing and copious self-expression. Not solitary unknowability. But there's no reason to equate what is shared in social media with what is authentic about the self. Social media can support Winnicott's negative theology of self by allowing us to express precisely what is inessential about ourselves, establishing through that copious sort of confession of inessential trivialities, the negative space where the ineffable self can reside. Sharing then becomes a process of shedding, a way to purge what we think we know about ourselves, but which is inherently wrong because it's expressible. Our true self is then constituted in the silences. The network, in this sense, actually alters us to have a soul, preparing the ground for it. And intimacy, then, is going over someone's social media offerings and reassuring them that none of that actually seems like them at all. The death of intimacy, then, on the other hand, is when someone looks at your Facebook and thinks, oh, that's you. You really got yourself pegged. So, if our deepest self is inexpressible by definition, however, it seems nonsensical to make expressing the true self into any kind of life goal. personal or artistic expression cannot be about sincerity or authenticity. But few people, I think, would accept that as what they're doing when they're using social media, that they're being sort of purposely inauthentic and false. So what is going on social media if there is this negative theology of self in operation? I think what we have is the viral self, what I'm calling the viral self. It's like what I call the post-authentic self in the presentation I gave last year. I think the uselessly inexpressible true self dooms us to an unbridgeable isolation despite the way that social media connects everybody all together all the time. I think that this brings about this complementary self, a viral post-authentic self as a sort of as a companion. The post-authentic self is premised on the possibility that one's traces, the ephemera of everyday life that's being ejected from the negative theology self, it can all be processed into a makeshift provisional identity on social media platforms through the feedback of others and through algorithmic processing. This identity can be shared and consumed not only by others but by oneself. You can enjoy yourself as a novelty item rather than confront oneself as a problem to solve, or as a set of inborn constraints, some true self that limits you. I think the what would I say on Facebook thing that happened a few years ago, I think is a good example of this. It goes through your Facebook feed, it produces content that you might have produced based on all the things you produced before, and then you get to read over and think, oh, haha, look, that's so much like me, or that's so funny, I would never say that. But you get to experience yourself as a product within, thanks to the way that you're being processed in the networks. So, post-authenticity, and I think it has a lot to do with with the idea of normcore, which is another way of expressing the same sorts of ideas, I think. It rationalizes the terror of ubiquitous surveillance and makes sort of the accelerated consumption online benevolent. It becomes what you're doing to feed these algorithms to produce a product of yourself that you can then enjoy. It helps you ease the burden of being a unique and true self. The burden of the uniqueness becomes placed on the algorithms, not on us. So being on social media deepens the awareness of what can't be shared at the same time, protecting that exclusionary purity of the inexpressible self within us. That's now beyond public appropriation. In the meantime, the metrics and the algorithms stand in as a quasi-populist proxy for the post-authentic self's approving other in the circuit of self-production. The algorithms get to confirm, give us social recognition in the broadest sense, rather than being dependent on other individuals. So I think post-authenticity, it moves us from brand to mean. It rejects specific consumer signifiers of the self. Their increased circulation in social media makes their meaning a bit unreliable anyway, in favor of engagement metrics that track content, which become the new reliable basis for the self. With the self grounded in metrics rather than in specific content, one positions oneself in the social media environment less as a personal brand than as a meme. One adopts a viral self anchored in continual demonstrations of its reach based on ingenious appropriation and aggregation of existing content, not in personal expression or fidelity to some inner truth or some personal taste that's internal. It's defined by what it can circulate, not by what it circulates. And to make the self as meme register, it's imperative to associate oneself with dynamic, emotionally resonant, viral content. This is a different kind of content, I think, than brands or the sort of traditional signifiers that consumerism studies have talked about for a long time. That seems sort of static as you adopt them, and then they sort of die when you adopt them. There's a theory that you consume the object and then your fantasy is over because now you have the thing and it sort of kills what it signified for you. I think that viral content sort of is an evolution of that. It keeps the feeling alive in the way it circulates rather than the fact that you possess it. By sharing viral content, the self is in play. We don't circulate the meme so much as the memes circulate us. And that's why Yakov Smirnoff is up there. Virality serves as an equally tautological token of authenticity, but unlike the old version of authenticity, it's just a replacement for the old sense that, being spontaneous makes you authentic. Now, instead, sort of being viral makes you authentic within this construct, within this particular kind of selfhood. With content receding to be a mere alibi for engaging emotionally, content recedes to mere alibi for engaging emotionally with the circulation data. We vicariously identify not with the content, but with how information travels. We're not thinking about the participation is in the circulation, not in what the thing being circulated seems to signify. So we shift from consumerist pleasures of fantasizing about how owning certain branded goods would make us into a certain kind of person and secure us a certain kind of affirmation, to fantasizing about triumphant moments of social quantification, about getting likes and retweets and having lots of Tumblr activity and so on. So virality becomes a sort of horizon beneath which occurrences no longer figure socially. If it doesn't go viral to a certain extent, it no longer counts as being about yourself. It's no longer real. It's no longer authentic. And so if you have no activity, you're in a bit of a post-authentic dilemma. That's from my own Tumblr. It's very depressing. So I think, like, a look at the most notorious supplier of viral content, Upworthy, may give us shed some light on how we can adopt virality as a technique of the self and engineer virality as an end in itself. So one of the things that Upworthy shows is that no content, I think, or no self is inherently viral, and likewise, no content is inherently non-viral. Optimization techniques can always be applied. Now, Upworthy's putative goal is to get its preferred content past whatever filters people have set up and into massive circulation. But their tricks end up trumping the content, so the techniques to circulate the material are much more revealing than the quote, things that matter that Upworthy says it's all about. The circulation, again, is the content. The most notorious of Upworthy's techniques is the much parodied curiosity gap headline, and I've given a few examples here. That I just pulled off the page yesterday. But that format, is much parody. It's kind of becoming stale, as they said. They were profiled in New York Magazine. They said that these headlines are starting to no longer be as virally potent. They're trying to shift strategies. And the point of that is that the specific formula is not the key. That's not what's viral. What matters is the formula itself, that the formulas are being applied. And then they reveal through A/B testing of different headlines which one is the real version. The one that gets the most hits is the real version. And I think that the Upworthy success of that shows a sense of how you can conceive identity in the same way, that the real version of your identity is not necessarily everything you post, but it's what gets traffic, what rises above the horizon of reality. Nothing else really matters. No one else will really see that stuff. So just as genuineness has proved irrelevant to the content's potential virality, stories that go viral are often debunked, it's also irrelevant to the viral self, whose authenticity is an after effect of having marshaled an audience. Realness is a matter of attention metrics rather than the fidelity of the content to some core truth. Typical Upworthy material doesn't privilege uniqueness or complex emotional responses, of course. Such subtleties belong to the sort of negative theology of self world of being so unique that you can't express yourself comprehensibly. I think Upworthy emphasizes the formulas because they're comforting and they're uncool. They repel cynics who are more invested in exclusion than inclusion. Upworthy says that they're trying to reach people where they're at. They say, you don't want to be that guy in your Facebook feed saying, these were thuglicans out there. You don't want to be the person who's being overtly political. That might be good advice to go viral on Facebook, but I think it's more significant. There's the assumption built into that about who you are. You are a guy in a Facebook feed. Upworthy content strives to let you become that guy in the Facebook feed and not get filtered out from that site of viral selfhood. So Upworthy's intensive use of formulas illustrates how virality becomes a formal genre, recognizable independent of its circulation data. This helps permit one to experience virality as a feeling and identify with it in the face of inevitably disappointing actual metrics. At a certain point, virality no longer is a horizon, but it's just a feeling. It's an impulse, it's an instinct, like Gawker's former viral content guru, Nitzan Zimmerman, sort of would operate it sort of purely by impulse, by instinct, because virality had become a feeling about content as opposed to an actual proven out by data ahead of time. Anyway, by encoding audience enthusiasm at the level of form, viral content promotes vicarious participation not only in the viral story, whose apparent popularity helps encourage an indulgent suspension of disbelief, but in the social itself, conceived as a flow of information in social networks. The function of a story in social relations is shifted. It's not retold in time and dependent on co-presence, but is instead linking people in space and told by being harvested in networks and by being circulated. All right. Here's some ramifications of the viral self. Yeah. If virality is the model, then social media participation ultimately has no content. It is just a matter of exchanging and tallying gestures of sharing. As virality supplants authenticity, the emotion that viral content provokes, a feeling of spreading connection, threatens to become the root of all authentic feeling. Having other sorts of feelings becomes pointless if you can't be seen having them. what we want to feel is only what will spread. For instance, because I know my reactions reading things can be performed on Twitter, I'm sure to have a reaction and then to method act my response and see how it goes over, see if it becomes a real response by people retweeting it and so on and so forth. And that's just sort of an added incentive we get to be reading and doing things in social media rather than outside of social media where you don't have any confirmation. The ubiquity of virality makes it seem as though one can fit in only by spreading oneself indiscriminately. Social media sustain a measurement system that makes more attention seem always appropriate and anything less insufficient. If your appropriated content is not circulating, then you are disappearing. And this can feel like total exclusion. You're adding nothing to the social bottom line, and unlike Upworthy, you're not inspiring anybody. But I also think it's worth remembering that it's also a confirmation that this other sort of authentic self that must disappear to exist is properly disappearing in a comforting way. So that's what I have.
Thank you so much to our panelists. That was really lovely. I love the balance of that we start off kind of in this very hopeful note of limited democracy and criticism and the political potential of memes and virality, and then we get to end with sort of a more balanced approach to understanding possibly some of the negative impacts that has on us as selves and individuals. So I want to check in with Kate and see what's going on in the back channel, or
we don't have any questions yet. I'm posting the last tweet and then I will check again.
Excellent. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question for Patrick. Hi, I'm Eric Gray from MIT Center for Civic Media. Love the talk, really fascinating stuff. I've been thinking about this question of political memes as well for the past couple of years. And one of the things that Ethan and I talk about, because I work with him at MIT, is whether or not that capacity building works in different environments. Yeah. So I'm curious if you could expand a little bit on the Vietnam case of where you see political memes fitting into maybe the start of a ladder of engagement for other citizens, either online or maybe it moves into in-person spaces. So just can you talk a little bit about where you see it connected into a larger set of civic actions?
Well, I said in the talk, it's important not to make the mistake of viewing all this through Western assumptions. And the typical Western assumption is that we're going to see the standard way of this stuff materializing is going to be in massive street protest and revolution of the sort that we've seen in the past several years. And having spent 6 years in Vietnam, I cannot imagine that happening. I simply can't see how that's conceivable, knowing what little I do of Vietnamese people and the culture. What is just there's this idea, and I touch on it here, is of this Confucian ideas that your personal interests are they're subservient to the interests of the state and the collective and the community itself. That is really, really powerful in a place like Vietnam. And so when I talk about capacity building, what I mean is not the capacity to rise up and overwhelm the entrenched political elite, but to make themselves understand that the role of citizens in a republic can be much stronger than simply being the targets of this very paternalistic style of government. That's why they buy into the idea of censorship, because they literally believe, many of them, especially older people, that this is the government taking care of them, and that's the government's job. And they are the ones to be taken care of as a parent takes care of a child. So I think the role of capacity building in that sense is one in which Vietnamese people, and by extension, people in many authoritarian, certainly Confucian cultures, understand that they are more than children and that they can be responsible for and be capable of governing themselves in a sense. That's not something that happens overnight.
Do you see that manifesting in any other types of actions or ways that they're talking about things?
I do. One of the things that I showed on here, I didn't talk about it, but some of the examples that I used was talking about the telecoms and raising the rates of 3G. And that was a big discussion last year, The telecoms, of course, are all state-owned, as many of the big utilities there are, and that means they're owned by top members of the Communist Party. And those guys do pretty much whatever they want. They want to raise the rates, they just do it. They don't have to ask permission. And there's become a lot of cynicism about that and a lot more open-eyed awareness of how that process works in a way that they're willing to talk about it a lot more openly than they were. Before it was just, well, that's the way things are. And it's quite clear now that they're becoming more and more dissatisfied with that status quo. And what's happening is they are going to push for more transparency. They're going to push for more accountability. And those are the ways in which this is going to happen. It's going to be in a drive for accountability, transparency, rather than again radical revolutionary. Yeah.
Anything else?
I have a question. Do you think that like the Hunger Games being allowed, like the second Hunger Games, they just let that sort of go and be in Vietnam? Do you think that's like a hopeful sign or a sign that like they realize that like there's no real political potency in that kind of like, I don't know, revolutionary symbolism in media or something, that they feel like that's what they've seen of viral culture in Vietnam makes them think that like it's maybe powerless as opposed to powerful?
It's a great question. The fact that the first Hunger Games was banned the first time around in 2012 probably meant that they were afraid of the embedded message in there that people should rebel against the government. What is interesting is that when they showed the Hunger Games the second time, they allowed all that stuff, which was really much more revolutionary. Yeah. The second was much more about revolution, which I thought was funny. But it was interesting that every mention of the word revolution in Catching Fire was subtitled in the Vietnamese subtitles as "this stuff." They never translated revolution directly. It was "this stuff." Whatever the stuff is. Oh, just the other stuff that's going on over there. You don't need to know much about it.
The stuff will not be televised.
Yeah. It's as to whether they realize maybe it is just entertainment and Vietnamese people don't see anything in that. And if that's true, then they're giving Vietnamese people, I don't know whether that's cynical or hopeful. Mm-hmm. I really don't.
I had a question about a lot of the memes that you showed were both in Vietnamese and English. Are they looking to spread to a larger English-speaking audience, or is there just a lot of English speakers in Vietnam?
The ones that I put up there, all the English was just my translation of the memes, so that I presume there aren't that many Vietnamese speakers in here. So I just translated those in English, but no, And a lot of those memes also, especially the stuff from Tweet Bitch, I gave a very cursory kind of translation. If I were really to translate all the levels of meaning and sub-meaning in there, it would take 10 minutes. Because it all has to do with local context and situations and events and people and all the different semiotic connotations attached to all that stuff. And it's really interesting and fun, but it doesn't translate well because it's so deeply embedded in the local culture.
We have a question from Twitter from Civic Beat on Chomina and fans. So how much does the social impact of memes need to be taken in the socio-political context they emerge in? And this is for all of you.
Oh, why don't you do that one? Yeah.
Well, I mean, what was the question again?
In a particular social
How much does the social impact of memes need to be taken in the socio-political context they emerge in?
A lot.
Yeah.
I think, the context would probably matter quite a bit. I mean, we're getting a lot of that today. But there was something that was interesting mentioned before about this idea of the ladder of engagement. And it reminds me a lot of what this sort of group of theorists sort of organized around civic cultures. Peter Dahlgren and many other people have written about civic cultures as trying to push people up the ladder of engagement by creating citizenship. And I think that's probably a fairly Western idea, I guess, of a Western style of citizenship. But actually, what I wanted to mention about that is that the stuff that I was talking about today was, kind of is proposing that there is no ladder of engagement, that this is sort of, that this theory of virality is sort of an end in itself, that you're supposed to transform a culture. And actually, I think Ethan Zuckerman, when he's mentioning the cultural theory of change as opposed to a legislative theory of change, is trying to say that there's such a long-term cultural effect. So what's going on in Vietnam right now might not be, affecting real change for years, but maybe it's the start of something. That idea, I think, is kind of interesting because it's very, it's very promising, and also at the same time, it's completely undetectable in a sort of in a social scientific sense. We don't really know what's going on. So I believe that there's a lot of actual kind of faith and hope that sending around memes and viral content will transform a culture, and so that people growing up in that culture will then 20 years from now create real, actual, perhaps legislative kinds of change. But I think that the viral stuff that we're talking about often doesn't go along with this idea of a ladder of engagement, that people are going to see it and all of a sudden say, boy, I'm going to join a social movement organization. It really does kind of exist on its own. And I think that's why it's, on the one hand, seems so seductive because it seems easy. And the other hand, people are so worried about it because it does seem a little bit too facile, right?
Yeah, it's like the sort of slacktivism critique.
Yeah.
Like, you end up doing these things, and this is sort of like where I'm coming from, is that you do these things within social media, and like, it's like the goals of social media become your goals as opposed to whatever ostensibly it is you're talking about in a certain way. Like, the tool becomes like the end in itself, and what you're using the tool to convey is hard to hold on to. The more you sort of get invested in the techniques of social media and what have you, they start to become, they start to sort of precede it. And maybe that's just some of that cynicism on my part, where I think, and this is where it's like the Western culture of individualism and sort of narcissism, if you want to call it that sort of is hard to imagine that you wouldn't just see, this is an opportunity to get me out there. Like, who cares about social justice? What about me?
Yeah.
Or social justice is a good way to make people think I'm cool. So I mean, I think that's a very culturally conditioned attitude towards the usefulness of the tool.
I'll ask a question. Mike's for the feed, sure. So as someone who's years away from, or years out from the sociological training that I had, a lot of the conversations you have about the self in relation to tools and how we interact with others they're about how the individual connects with society, not about the individual's relationship with self.
Mm-hmm.
Can you clear that up for me?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of operating from the assumption that like the individual's relation to self is sort of an after effect of the individual's relation to society. That the authentic self is a consequence of social interaction or being in a social condition, or being in social conditions where that can happen, where that can emerge, where you can emerge out of like the social nurturing that's required to survive into like some sense of like your own individual significance. Is that helping? Is this what you're getting at?
I don't see how being able to see and therefore track social interaction and influence is a removal of your own ability to be authentic.
Okay.
Well, sorry, wasn't it Sherry Turkle who was asking the question, is there even any such thing as an authentic self? And to what extent does social media and our ability to disperse ourselves across various platforms and create all these different versions of ourselves and identities, does that help us get any closer to an actual version of a true version of us? Or are we simply the sum total of our distributed selves across all those different areas?
Yeah, I think those distributed selves, sort of one argument here is that those are all various sort of rejected selves, or sort of like basically tool selves that you use to sort of like participate in the social and refine this sense of who you really are, which is this inexpressible, soulful thing that can't possibly be captured in social media because it's too pure and so on. So I think that for me that tells that authenticity is like a product. The soul is a product of the social media. It's not something that you're born with and then like social media threatens it. It's more that you use social media and you see, oh, the things I can't talk about, maybe those are the things that are really important about me. And then I'm going to keep talking until I keep getting a clearer sense in my own head, this inexpressible stuff that's like the true me. And I think that there's a sort of an oscillation between this like self you're laboring hard to project into the world and the self that you're kind of protecting from the world. There's sort of a dialectic there.
I have a Twitter question. Someone wants to know if Rob has looked at the proliferation of personality quizzes because they seem to be a good example of your arguments.
Yeah, no, it's a good example. Yeah, I mean, I haven't taken many of them, but I think that that's like another good example of like the what would I say on Facebook? It's like what kind of what character on Game of Thrones am I? Like like wanting to find out something about yourself that like you don't know, but like somehow algorithms know about you, and this sort of like the sort of like eagerness to engage with that stuff, I think is sort of like it implies that like I don't know who I am, this computer knows better who I am, and like the trust in that sort of like so unthinkingly, I think is a change that's sort of come about through like a sort of more intensely mediated sort of being.
I actually wanted to ask you something. This is something that's come up a lot, and I've done some studies recently of these kind of activist profile picture changing campaigns, and I find that activity really interesting because there you are, you're replacing your avatar with like a social movement symbol that sort of takes away your own personal, face, your identity, and you're replacing that with this is what I believe in, right? And one thing when I talk about this with people, there's that idea that you're really doing this just to make yourself look good. You want to come off as socially aware. You want to come off as like an activist. You're not really doing this for politically, real reasons. You're doing this for self kind of promotion and self-identity construction. And I found that there's probably, just from a little bit of the research that I've done with people who participate in campaigns like that, there's a real mixture of sort of self-interest and also this kind of civics, right? The sense that, I'm really doing this because I'm changing my profile picture to save the world kind of thing,
right.
Which is, of course, does that work? It was when I was questioning before, but I don't know what you think about that.
No, well, I mean, I think that like replacing, there's like I don't think that when you replace your face with another picture, like that picture becomes your face in a way. It's not like that you've effaced your identity and like replaced it with this cause. Instead you're saying, I've subordinated this cause to me, is how I would interpret that. Sort of like, your selfie becomes whatever the cause is. It doesn't necessarily have to include like a literal picture of yourself in it. If it's in the location of a selfie, then it becomes a selfie, and whatever's projected there is just you in a new format. I mean, that's sort of how the profile...
And I was thinking particularly about that I mentioned before, the red equal signs for same-sex marriage equality, and at the time it was so popular that when you would log into Facebook, you'd see just like a sea of red images, and it was sort of like, it did kind of sort of alter your perception of your friends and people. It's instead of seeing all these people's faces, it's just this one image repeated over and over again. Of course, people did a lot of sort of meme variations on it to personalize it after a while, but also there was a lot of just simply that one symbol. And I'm kind of curious about that kind of aggregate effect where it does seem like you're subsuming yourself to this group. You want to be part of a group expression of identity as opposed to a... Yeah, no, that's a good counterexample. It's like that's like a sort of an optimistic moment. And it seems like, like you're saying, it sort of rapidly decays, but you get a glimpse of like the kind of collective possibilities that, that can emerge despite sort of hyper-individualization of the medium. But you're right that the fact that like there were so many kind of versions that everybody, I want to have mine have like, Snoopy from Peanuts on it, or I want to have Wonder Woman on mine, equal sign, kind of, goes back to what you're saying, that there is this impulse that we kind of have to have this, the affordances of the tools start to take over from whatever it is that you're trying to focus on the cause. And I'm not sure like I don't know what can prevent that. I don't know. I don't have a theory for why that happens. That just is sort of, I don't know. I'm basing that theory on my cynicism right now, which is not, maybe I shouldn't admit that.
talking about right now, how is that different from actual on the ground protests? Because shouldn't you say the same thing about people who show up at protests, that some of them are there just to be seen and represent themselves for the cause?
No, that seems like a pretty accurate description. I don't know. I mean, like, that was the experience of Occupy Wall Street, right? It was like you had people who were sort of like kind of professional activists, and you had people who were sort of like tourists who wanted to be part of a thing. And, really, you could cynically atomize everybody participating. At the individual level, it is a very cynical project. But there's like the banking, you're banking on like that moment you're just describing where everyone seems to suddenly have the same icon and you've effaced individuality and there's a collective mass operating for a collective reason. And so all those individual sort of like motives and distinctions start to fade. But, that's, I don't know what, it's like the event happened or something, You have to sort of faith that that's going to take place at a certain critical mass. I don't know that like it can be sort of, I don't know, you can't like, ask everybody individually, so how much collectivity are you feeling right now? Because like then you've defeated the whole point of collectivity.
And surely that's been true of every protest in history. Mm-hmm. People, you go back to, talk to our parents' generation and they were going there just because they thought they could hook up with somebody. They didn't care. What are we protesting again? They didn't care. They were just there for a good time. But the collective, as you say, the collective outweighs the atomized little ideas and I think that's also true online just as much as it is in the real world.
I think that an in-person protest now, can be a media event as much as a social media sort of protest, right? The funny thing about Occupy Wall Street was that it wasn't an occupation. They didn't really attempt to shut down Wall Street in the way that buildings were occupied on college campuses in the 1960s. They were literally trying to shut down the operations of the university. So it was, in a sense, just a symbolic gesture, even if it was a media event in person as opposed to a media event taking place virtually. But I think it was rather the same, and that's what I was mentioning before about Lazin's connection to Occupy Wall Street. I really do think that was what he was coming at it from. He really saw this as simply a media event image that could then be transported into this more important media space, where he's basically saying that the physical reality is less important than the mediated reality, which is, again, that kind of the postmodern, idea or canard, if you depending on your point of view.
Just briefly, we have time for one more, so we'll do one last question.
There was a question in the back. I don't know if that was, yeah.
Oh yeah, can you come up to the microphone?
So my last question is something I've been pondering. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, everybody was looking at the internet and saying, oh, the slacktivism thing, that's pointless. And it's the lower coordination costs, the easy group formation, that's going to be its power. And what we're seeing is what's so-called slacktivism, the cultural change seems to be a lot more powerful sort of mid to long term. The gay marriage movement is an example, authoritarian states, everything. But the lower coordination cost seems to be the one backfiring, because after the movement erupts in a protest, there are no interfaces to engage with other kinds of politics. So is it are we at a reverse moment where the cultural content is revealed to be a lot more powerful, whereas the ridiculously easy group formation that was hailed as internet's political power may actually be the weakness because it's supplanting any other kind of organizing, and the movements don't know where to go besides cultural change. And you get the 1% meme, but we don't get any other, sort of visible effect yet.
Maybe I'll answer. I think that you're right. There's a possibility that this cultural change stuff does really have some meat to it, right? I don't think it necessarily should be dismissed, but I do think that it actually, and postmodern theory is really not trendy in academia right now. It's sort of had its day about a decade or two ago, but I think it's more relevant than ever in terms of really thinking about where we are. A lot of these folks, from it's kind of starting with Baudrillard and many others, were really saying, we are really living in hyper-reality, and that, sort of cultural exchanges that are happening in electronic networks is the reality. And I think there is some degree of merit to that, or at least it should be considered more, because I think we are seeing, in a sense, that there's like this kind of, that kind of cultural activism, symbolic activism is what's really seems to be at least driving the conversation, if not having demonstrable effects as of yet. Is that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much to our panelists.